everyone here on this wonderful day, 1st of November. Did everybody have a great Halloween? Yes. Kind of. Well, we're going to be here together for the next about 50-55 minutes. We have packed it with a bunch of wonderful little pieces of information and experiences. I am Tucson Meet Yourself. It's a Folklife festival. The word Folklife, we are asking you to use these stickers. If you want, it says, ask me about my folk life. How many of you are familiar with that word, folk life? That word is actually recognized in an act of Congress from 1976, creating the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. And the mission of that statement was to recognize America's informal rural culture. And what they meant by that was the culture that doesn't live in museums, that doesn't live in symphony halls, that lives in kitchens, in bakeries in the neighborhoods, in your homes, in your bedrooms, in your small altars, in the songs that you sing in the shower, in the things that you put on as a decoration in your home, and all of those things. And Congress decided to create a center at the Library of Congress to research and promote that, and since then the word folk life became preferred over the term folklore, because folklore referred most of the time to old world stories, narratives, Brother Grimm stories, and all of those sort of oral communication. So based on that experience, festivals like Tucson Meet Yourself began to come up around the country. And Tucson Meet Yourself is one of the longest ones. It's been around for 41 years, and it's fallen on me now to lead it. And together with the University School of Social and Behavioral Sciences, we just have formed a new organization that is now the producing parent of Tucson Meet Yourself, called the Southwest Folklife Alliance. And the presence of this alliance here today with Confluence is one example of the kind of programs we want to do. And what we do is we want to promote the appreciation and understanding. I always tell people, see this photo right here that we use to announce our Folklife Alliance, which you can pick up and read our mission and our programs, includes two ladies from the Spanish Club. The Spanish Club, or Club España, cooks at Tucson Meet Yourself. They cook a huge paella in a pot this big. How many of you have ever seen it or tasted it? What I tell people is, what makes folklife is that they don't just cook paella and dress like that and get together like that for Tucson Meet Yourself. This is what they do all the other 363 days of the year when they're not at the festival. And you're going to see today, we're going to meet the Franco family, which stands in the tradition of that. Sure, they have a special day when they prepare breads for Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, and they're going to tell us all about that. But really, their involvement with bread making as a profession, as an association, as a form of sharing cultures, spans year-round. It's part of their family history, it's part of their service to the community, and that's what makes it folk life. And authentic. And how many of us really are always longing and wanting authentic experiences in our life these days, right? Yes, amen to that. So, you know that funerary traditions, the death and food have always been together, and it's one of those few things that is almost universal. Almost every culture around the world that you can think of has had some kind of connection between the dead and processes of grieving and preparation of foods that are special for that. Of course, in Mexico, they blew the top out of that, and of course with Day of the Dead, it's just like magnify that 10 times, right? Because it is more colorful and it's more intense, it's more dramatic than in many ways. But if you think about it, every single culture that you can think of has some sort of relationship. And there are probably two main reasons for that we can think of from an anthropological point of view. The first one is the obvious metaphor that connects seeds and grains and food preparation as the sign of life, something that sustains life, something that generates life, with the contrast, which is something that ends life. So even though we may not think about it, the two are symbolically connected in our heads. And we tend to gravitate to those things that provide that sort of range of experience in extremes, right? So here we have death, we go to something that signifies birth, something that signifies renewal. And so you have the grounding of many of these traditions, of course, in rural communities, where you actually see the planting of particular seeds or plants, or the preparation of special meals that are seasonal, right? Where you use it. And seasonal also means that you're acknowledging the full range of how life cycles move. They come up, and then you have a moment of great abundance, and then something lays fallow for a while, and then it comes back out. So all of these things are very, almost universally human. The other reason that food and death seem to be connected so much is because of the possibility of kinship. Many people, when they think of death and they want to grieve, you don't want to do it alone. In fact, if you kind of grieve alone, it's sort of like the darkest nights of all the dark nights, right? But if you share that with others, it becomes more bearable. And we are just made like that. That's part of our makeup as humans. Just like we have genetic predispositions for certain things physiologically, we also have predispositions that are cultural, that are the things we want to do because that's our human nature, to be in community. So you think about that. When you get a group of people together and you want to form a firm kinship with them, what do you first think that you all, after you talk a little bit, but then after a while somebody says,
Break bread.
should we eat? Who's gonna prepare? And of course, these are universal sentiments. In some of the traditions, we know that the association of food has also been used to signify status. Who is the most prestigious person in the community, who has the highest ranking, and therefore specialty foods are given and prepared to people with a specialty. One of the most amazing things, though, about food is that food is the kind of thing, in funerary, is very important in the rituals of death. Food can work in two economies at the same time. Food is the kind of thing that can work as an economy of the marketplace, where this is what it costs, this is what you pay me, give me something in exchange, and I'll give it to you, right? So we know that that's fine. That's how food works in many contexts. I plant tomatoes, right? I take my tomatoes to the market. You give me money. You take my delicious tomatoes. I use your money to replant, right? To build the infrastructure of that's the market economy. What is the other economy of which food is a major component? It's something that researchers call the gifting economy, right? The economy of gift. That is not, the reciprocal exchange is not the same as money. It's simply the actual obligation that you establish in community to reciprocate. Isn't that amazing? That we can actually, as humans, exchange and participate in both of those economies simultaneously? That we can know and buy food and have to pay the value and the price that as a commodity, and at the same time I can use food and transform that into something that is completely divested of any economic value. And all of its value is in the gifting, right? In the fact that I give it to you and I'm reciprocating, and the reciprocal that I'm getting is kindness and a sense of fellowship with you. And that's why food is so fascinating in the context of grieving, because in that moment, that's the one quality that people really want to feel connected. So I won't talk a lot more. I just wanted to give you a general overview of how is it that, from an anthropology point of view, you can actually research. Actually, there's lots of wonderful books that you can read about possibilities of connecting death and food. We know that in America, from very early on, the first American settlers, the British customs established things such as funeral biscuits, where you actually created special biscuits that were shared. In funerals, we also know that church potlucks are a great place where a lot of community gets built, and sometimes those potlucks have generated quote-unquote traditions that we may not think are very traditional. For example, tuna salad. For example, cheese and potatoes casseroles. We have a neighbor here to the north of us where cheese and potato casseroles, or scallop potatoes, right, are sort of like a state dish. Anybody knows? Is it New Mexico? No? Where is potatoes and cheese casserole kind of like a... Idaho? Utah. Another one is in Utah. As a matter of fact, when they had the 2012 Olympics, Special Olympics, they actually, one of the souvenirs from Utah was actually a pot of potatoes and cheese. And many times inside Utah, in communities, especially in Mormon communities, it is known as funeral potatoes. Funeral potatoes, because it's the kind of casserole that you actually bring to share with others. And of course, there's nothing more American, there's no greater American food invention than the casserole. Right? It's an invention, actually. You know, the casserole actually comes from a period of hunger, from World War II, from the Depression, right? When people really had to make things stretch. So, you know, you mix up all kinds of things and conveniently package them as a meal. So anyway, I could go on and on just to give you a flavor of that. I want to invite my colleague. We were lucky enough this year to bring, for the first time in many years, to the U of A, a resident folklorist. And Nick here is finishing his Ph.D. in folklore. Part of his job at the U of A is to finish his dissertation. And he comes to us from Kentucky, and before that from Canada. And we are so excited because now we can take him around everywhere, every program we do, and say, here's a true folklorist. Come on, share some folklore stories. So Nic Hartmann, everybody.
So I actually am going to start with a story, just like Maribel kind of said. One of the things as folklorists that we look at these sort of notions of public and private, but also how people do things sort of unofficially as opposed to the official way of doing something.
Speak up a little bit.
Speak up.
Speak up.
Anyway, I was saying that we look at sometimes the official versus the unofficial notions of culture, also the public area versus private. And one of the things that I was interested in when Maribel asked me to come and talk to you, in Newfoundland, where I was living in Canada, I lived there for about 4 years. There's a very strong influence from Ireland and from the British Isles, and also a sort of very unofficial versus official notions of religion and how it plays a role in daily life. And so one of the things I became interested in was, how does alcohol play a role in a funeral? And so this is something that's been a big part of, there is a tradition. Some people, Vikings were traditionally buried with alcohol. Egyptians, the author Roald Dahl was actually buried with chocolates, burgundy, in addition to a power saw, a snooker cue, and several sets of pencils. But I went on, about a week ago, I went on Facebook and I said, any of my Newfoundland friends, do you have stories about people in your family being buried with alcohol? And about 5 people, most of them between the ages of 20 and 30, all sent me stories. I'm going to read one to you. This is start. This is a woman named Michelle. She lives in St. John's, the capital. She says, I was really close to my grandfather. In many ways, he was my best friend. I spent the entire day with him to give my grandmother a break because he suffered from COPD and emphysema for 15 years. He wasn't a big drinker, but he enjoyed a glass of whiskey in the afternoon, which I'd always make for him about 3 p.m. when I stayed with him. The last 2 weeks of his life included his birthday and he and his wife's wedding anniversary, and he was very troubled that he couldn't even have a drop of whiskey to celebrate. Mom and Nan didn't bring him any whiskey because, if I remember correctly, he had ulcers in his mouth, throat, and stomach, and the alcohol, as he liked it, just the whiskey over rocks, would have been very painful. Even still, it felt like he wanted a little drop. They should have let him. when he passed, this was something that really bothered me, that my grandpa hadn't gotten something he asked for. So I went out and I bought a small shot bottle of Jack Daniels the day before the funeral visitations. He only wanted a drop, and I thought this would be enough. As Mom and Nan were dealing with their own grief and not having a big extended family, and my brother was not home, I had most of the 2 days of visitations to myself. I brought the alcohol with me, but I believe it was the second day which Mom and Nan had left the room for a moment, and I was able to quickly sneak in the bottle. I placed it by his right hand in the casket and down a little bit to the bottom half of the coffin where it would not be visible. Nobody saw me, and I honestly felt a bit better once it had been done. It was to me a final something that I could do for Pop, and it was something that I had done on a regular basis for him. Get him a drink in the afternoon. I ended up telling my mom after the funeral, and she seemed to be furious. But it was never spoken about again. I think Dad talked some sense into her afterwards and explained why I did it. Maybe Mom, her grief just didn't remember. So this is a story of, this is not something that's really an official tradition, but it's a very family-focused private tradition, sort of a relationship between Michelle and her grandfather. And she made sure that he had a drop to go into the next life. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is these sort of example of public versus private, maybe even get into a little bit of this, some people, anthropologists refer to the sacred versus the profane. So one of the things I want to talk about, I have some experience working with Orthodox Christian communities where people from Greece, Lebanon, Syria, Russia, Serbia. And this is an example of a very official funeral tradition that has very many local variations. So when a person in an Orthodox church passes away, you don't use the term passing away, you say they repose, they've fallen asleep. The idea of death is very different. But 40 days after their passing, it's very customary for there to be a memorial service. And when you have a memorial service, the family is responsible for making something called koliva. Now, koliva is boiled wheat, and it's mixed with sugar and spices and almonds. The idea that wheat is a symbol of life, sort of the symbol of the cycle of life. And so it's been very, very commonly used. And koliva, what you do is the family is responsible for bringing it, so they privately at home will mix the wheat together with spices, cinnamon, and they'll put it in a bowl. And then on top, you put sugared almonds. You take almonds and powdered icing sugar, and they have to be white. You place them into a cross that goes across the bowl of wheat. And then you put a candle to it, and you bring it to church. And it is presented, the priest will bless it. There's a service that goes on, a little short, maybe 15-minute service. And this is done at 40 days after repose, a year, sometimes 5 years. Some people do it year after year after year as a memorial for the family. But then comes the public part. Once the koliva is blessed, everybody in the church that is present is given a small cup of koliva. It's usually in a little wax paper cup, and it's distributed among the people. And so everybody sort of eating koliva is a sign of participation in somebody honoring the dead. But some of the things that are interesting about it is it's actually considered extremely bad to leave any drop of koliva. The boiled wheat is many of you have had it, it's very tiny. It doesn't really, it's hard to get out of the cup. And so you will definitely see people who are in the narthex of the church trying to lick their bowls clean. I have done this several times myself. But it's something that, wheat being the symbol of life is a symbol of eternal life and an eternal life cycle. So it's a tradition that has sort of private applications. Greek and Russian funerals will often have koliva as part of it, and also, Maribel mentioned funeral biscuits. They call them panamakia in the Greek church, and that's usually followed by a Greek dinner, usually meat, spanakopita, like lots of very tasty food. But whereas in many American funerals, other people cook for the family themselves actually cooks for the mourners. It's something that's very traditional, and they're the ones who are responsible for providing it. Sometimes where people will have somebody cater it, but oftentimes it's kind of a process of helping people get through it through food. It almost becomes therapeutic. Part of also the tradition of certain societies vary the koliva. In Japan, for example, boiled wheat is not easy to find, so people use rice. And in former Soviet countries, wheat was very hard to acquire sometimes. There were food shortages, so people would often use barley or something they easily find. So it's sort of a official tradition with local variations, but unofficial. Part of those funeral traditions, especially in the Greek community, is a wake. And usually a wake is involved, people will come over to the house, we'll have brandy, coffee, and pentakia. And so it's this idea of this sort of shifting from a public to private space. And in Newfoundland, this was a really, really big deal for a very long time. A lot of people, I think, associate Irish wakes with a lot of alcohol, a lot of people sitting around drinking. So, and this is, although it's very somewhat extreme, it's actually in the history, if you look at Newfoundland folklore, it's largely true. There was a very strong belief, and this goes back all the way back to pre-Christian Celtic religion, that before a body is buried, the people have to sort of arrange it so that there's peace with the deceased before they're buried. Because if you don't do it before then things may stir up later on, something supernatural. So it's until about the 1970s and 1980s, many Newfoundland rural communities had wakes. And what they would do is that first the family would have what they call the scoff. The scoff is Newfoundland slang for a giant meal. Sometimes corned beef, cabbage, salt pork, a lot of comfort food, like Maribel was talking about, such as it's like sort of the Newfoundland version of funeral potatoes, something like that. But and the scoff was something in which all people participated in. But eventually, there would be the elders of the community would leave, and the young members of the community were the ones who were responsible for remaining with the body. Well, that's when the wake gets a little bit crazy. And you start to see, the idea was that because the young members of the community were seen as the ones who were physically able to stay up, they were young, they were full of vitality and things that people associate with young folks. But then there was often, people were commonly drinking whiskey, smoking tobacco. These were actually ways of honoring the dead. But sometimes what would happen in these cases is that people would get into the whiskey a little too much and start to play pranks on each other as a way to stay awake during the wake. So you have cases where mourners would be sleeping and people would have pour a little bit of the drink on them, or they would light their cigarette while they were asleep. These things are, it's very subversive and very unofficial. It's not something that the local priest would necessarily support, but it was important to local people because this is their way of honoring. It also brought people status. If you could play a successful wake prank, then you were actually, many men in Newfoundland use it as a way of courting. But, so the wake is, like I said, we have a meal, we have alcohol, we have tobacco. These are always by eating in the same room as the deceased, drinking the same room, smoking. You were honoring them with your presence, even if your presence was a little bit subversive, a little bit pranksterish. And there's been a lot of very, very humorous occasions with this, but I have one that particularly caught my attention. And this is a story. This has actually been transmitted all around Newfoundland. I don't know which community it came from, but it says this person died, and it was in the wintertime, and the only bit of ground that they had around there was on a hill someplace, or the other where the graveyard was situated. So they had to wake the fellow, you see, before the burial. They had to have a wake, and everybody got postured out of their story. This is the verbatim from the story. So finally, after a time, they decided they'd finally put him in the ground. They started up the hill. They had the fellow on the sleigh. They got about halfway up, and who was pulling the thing along, I guess the line broke. Something like that happened, and he started down the hill, and one fellow hollered, "Stop him, for God's sake, he'll be killed." So in this case, Newfoundland has historically been a rural fishing province where there's a lot of poverty. A lot of people struggled economically, struggled to make ends meet. If you had a bad fishing season, you had a bad year. And a lot of people died young from fishing accidents, from diseases. And humor was often as a way for people to sort of overcome the anxieties of death in the next life. And food was a part of that. Food and alcohol served that role and played that role. And we see this all over, from alcohol burials, but it's kind of tapered off because then you started to see the rise of funeral homes. And also, people were instead usually brought to a funeral home for the service, but the families were usually the ones who were responsible for bringing the body themselves to the funeral home. Families, oftentimes the priest would go knocking on the door and find the family were still having their wake when they were supposed to be at the funeral. So it's a tradition that's tapered off that some people have still seen, but it's an example of sort of an unofficial tradition. It's not part of a typical funeral service. It's not really sanctioned by religion, but folklorists are very fascinated. What do people do on a daily basis, and how do people understand topics such as death? How do people understand the role of food, drink, togetherness? So you have a community ritual that plays an important role, and it all starts with a little bit of corned beef and cabbage and a little bit of whiskey. With that in mind,
Great, thank you. So now we have proven the point that if you have a family gathering and you need some entertainment, invite a folklorist. I want to thank our staff at the Southwest Folklife Alliance, Leah Mas, for setting up and working, as well as the staff of Confluence. And we love working with you. Well, we are in Tucson, Arizona, aren't we? Yeah. So, Day of the Dead, please come over. We have one of the great teachers. Tradition bearers is a time. Sometimes tradition bearer is a term that folklorists use for people who are really, really old. What I love about Erica and the Franco family is that they embody tradition bearing from all of the generations of the family. So I know she's gonna take it away, as they say in show business, and talk about both her family and the bakery, as well as these amazing creations that they are gonna make for us today. Oh, and don't forget, I hope you left some room for after lunch, because we're gonna taste, and it's pretty much dessert.
It is. While I was sitting down, I was thinking, I don't have a story. But I think I do. I think what Maribel mentioned, that the food and the alcohol is very important. And I was remembering about a customer at Estrella Bakery. She came in and she ordered 20 dozen of sweet bread mix. So she had everybody working and as fast as we could. And then I asked her, "Oh, you have a party?" And she said, "No, I have a funeral." And there was a customer right next to her, and she said, "How can you ask her that?" And the customer who was paying for the 20 dozen of bandulce said, "No, it is a party. We're gonna be together all as a family." And the other customer was like, "Oh wow." So they started talking about the difference in culture. So that's one of the things that is amazing about Tucson, that Tucson has so many cultures and we all share it. And throughout the years, we share the Day of the Dead, the Mexican tradition, right? How many of you have driven through Tucson and begin to see all these skulls, all these colorful skulls, all these altars? Yeah? Well, another thing that Maribel mentioned that about the Tucson, me herself, about the Spanish, with the family, or España, they don't dress up, they don't cook just one day of the year. That's how the Franco family is. We work 360 days of the year, and we dedicate this to the community. So what we're going to do today, this is my sister Sandra, my little sister Sandra. We're going to show you how to make pan de muerto. Pan de muerto. I mean, we're not, professional TV. Try our best.
We're not a celebrity.
We're not a celebrity
yet.
We want to be celebrities, but we're not. Okay. So, what I did is I brought some containers with our main ingredients here. Okay. And one of the things that I must say about the pan de muerto is flour, yeast, vegetable shortening, butter, a lemon or orange flavor. Okay. Some people use artificial flavor, some people go all the way and boil their leaves from the tree, back of the yard, lemon or orange, vanilla, eggs, sugar, salt, and lots of love.
Yeah.
Right? Lots of love. Okay. So basically what I did is I brought the dough already prepared. Okay, so this could be a little bit more easier. We make different sizes. We make individual sizes like 4 or 5 inch. So one of the things about the dough is that you have to work fast because of the yeast. It grows really fast on you, especially if you're going to be very detailed, like these panes de muerto that we have here. Okay, but the most typical one that we have is this one right here with sugar. Although in some parts of Mexico they add sesame seeds instead of sugar. And it's very, very important for you to have pan de muerto in an altar. Does anybody know why? No?
As an offering.
As an offering to the deceased, right? So the pan de muerto usually is, the altar is 3 layers or more, and it's usually placed next to the picture of the deceased. Okay, and as you might know, there's sampasuchi flower. Okay, all the way there's like a path through the door. Okay, that way the deceased will come, or your loved one will come, and know, where his altar is placed, and he or she will know where the day of the dead, the bread of the dead is at. Okay, so actually the original one has 5 of these, which represents the hand of the deceased. So this here in the center, these are all bones, right? These represent bones. So this one here in the center is this bone that we have, right, on our hand. So that it symbolizes the hand. So you have to work very fast with this. The most difficult part, I must say, is the bones, making of the bones. So what you do is you make these little balls like this. Those you could let them grow for a bit. This might be a little bit hard, but I'm usually faster. And some bakers use their sugar to make the bones. It depends on the baker's hand, how big it is. Okay? So my hand is not very big, so I'm gonna try to do this. If not, I'm gonna do it individually. How many of you have been to La Estrella Bakery? Oh, great. Thank you. Yesterday was our anniversary, 28 years. Oh. I thought my dad was going to say, okay, this year you guys have a day off. but we did it. So what you do is you place just like this. Last weekend I went to Mexico City because I go to Mexico City to a certain supermarket or mercado called La Merced, and that's where I buy all the tools or the utensils for the bakery. And it was just an amazing experience because everything's about the Day of the Dead. Everything.
Good.
tolerant. So that's one of the reasons why we're trying to work it. Our bakers have big hands, so you know they just use their hand to do this. Just gonna have that. Okay. Once it's done like that, like this, you let it rise a little bit. It actually takes a long time. It takes about 45 minutes for this to rise. So this is why we always tell our customers, it takes a lot of time. So, and also, when you have your pan de muerto all settled with the bones, the bone that you put in the middle, you leave it on the side for 45 minutes, and then you put a little bit of vegetable shortening or a little bit of oil, butter, and then you just place it here. And 45 minutes to an hour, it's ready to place in the oven. And it takes about 30 to 35 minutes for it to be ready. So, any questions so far? No? Okay. So, I think this one's better though. This is your final pan de muerto, like this. Okay. Once it's cooled down, what we do is we decorate it. Now, one of the things that I noticed in Mexico City is that all of the pan de muerto have white sugar. Very little white sugar. But I think in our bakery, a lot of customers convinced us to add more sugar. So I started adding color to it because that's what it's all about, right? Dia de los Muertos, for everybody to be happy and use these bright colors, right? So after it's done, we put a little bit of, I want to say honey, but it's not quite as, the texture is not quite as honey. This is very basic. What you do is you boil sugar with water and you add sticks of cinnamon. Just let it boil to a certain texture, not quite water, like this. And after you just sometimes if the bones are not well placed, they might break. Just like my buddy here had a little accident. So you do this, and then you add bright colors. You're using yellow.
So are you saying that the ones in Mexico City had no color?
They were all white. All white.
So this is a Southwest adaptation.
Yeah. I mean, that food is always changing, right? Just like a, and if that's not enough sugar, you add a little bit more. And then the pan de muerto is done. It's ready to place it in the altar, and it's ready to share with your family. Each year we have more of these ordered with the sesame seeds, just plain pan de muerto. And what's interesting about the pan de muerto, we have customers that are that want them fresh. We sell our bread fresh every day. But there are other customers, especially from the south of southern Mexico, that they prefer for the pan de muerto to be a day old or 2 days old. kind of like a soup, like pozole, for example. It's tastier when it's older. So this is it. And as you can see, we also make different types of figurines. We have this, what's his name? Macario. Macario here. We make female versions as well. We make faces. Any questions so far?
How many special orders do you get on the average?
Special orders, so far, and considering that the actual days, well, we'll start going to the cemeteries today, but we've had maybe 350 pre-orders. That's aside from the ones that we bake out to the public. Yes.
After the bread is on the altar, is that the bread that you eat, or you make a separate bread if the bread stays on the altar?
We make, no, the bread stays at the altar. So usually it's smaller than the one. And then we make share with our stuff. Any more questions? Just to share another thing that we also do is we make the sugar skulls. Okay? We also make the sugar skulls. Very typical in the Mexican tradition is to have sugar skulls with the names of friends, or if you're gonna make an altar to Macario. Okay, I would write Macario here and place it in this altar. So we also make sugar skulls. This week I made 350. I decorated 350 sugar skulls for a wedding cake. For a wedding cake. Yeah. So, and I was surprised, but then I said, "Wow, that's great," because it wasn't a Latina, it wasn't a Mexican family. So it made me happy how much the Mexican culture has influenced a lot of the communities. Okay, so I did bring 3. This is very I'm actually the one that decorates the sugar skulls. We all have our little. Sandra does some of the decorating of the muertos.
Yes, I'm actually a full-time elementary teacher. I do contribute throughout the week. For example, this week, in the afternoons, I would head over there and start decorating, helping out the family.
We've actually, it's a family-owned business. So my parents opened it 28 years ago. With 4 children, so every day, out of school to the bakery, do your homework at the bakery. So sometimes I would turn in my homework with a little bit of vegetable shortening or something, but the teacher knew about it. So yes, we're very dedicated to it. I must say, at the beginning, it was hard. It was hard being a teenager and going to the bakery rather than going to the music with your friends. But my parents are very, very traditional. So we were always raised going to the bakery, working. Now we see it in a different way. Now we're really proud. So a couple of years ago, maybe 4 years ago, my parents started talking about maybe selling the business, and we said, no, this is our second home. We can't do that.
And I mean, thanks to the business, 3 of us, we were able to go to college, get our masters, and that's how we see it. This is a way for us saying thank you, right? Because we wouldn't have the education we have if it wasn't for the bakery.
Do you have grandchildren helping now?
That's another story.
Usually what happens, usually it's
I'm actually the only one that doesn't have children. But we've talked about, is this going to end with this generation, or is it going to continue?
It's tough. Yeah.
And I tell them, well, as long as they put their little computers on the side and right. So we invite you anytime you want a tour at the bakery and actually see how we do the baking daily. You're more than welcome to call and ask for me, Erica, and I would be more than happy to show you around and see.
Where are you located?
We're located in the South 12th Avenue in Nebraska. That's our main location. We also have a second location at the Mercado San Agustin, which is in front of the youth clinic. And actually, we're going to have Calavera Festival tomorrow. You're going to have a chance to decorate sugars.
At which location?
At the Mercado.
Okay.
There's going to be face painting and other activities. Any more questions? Well,
Do we get to eat where these sugars go?
you know, they're edible, but it's hard. It's very hard.
Erica, can you talk about your tortilla side, the tortilla operation? Because you make amazing tortillas. The Estrella is also
Yes.
producer of tortillas. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. We also make flour tortilla. We're making we're actually starting a new version of tortillas. We make spinach tortillas, chipotle. We kind of like play around with other ingredients as well. We're part of the tortilla festival here in Tucson. This year will be the third year. Okay. And it's usually around the 5 de Mayo that we have the presidio. Any more questions?
How do we judge tortillas?
That actually festival is not judging. It's not judging. It's just for people to see how we make the tortillas, and we give samples, and we also sell, burritos and stuff like that. You want one? Yes. They are edible. There's too much sugar, water, and you always see kids at least eating the frosting. Any more questions? Well, thank you for inviting me.